So, where is fancy bread? In the heart or in the head? It's about my favorite quote from Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. And it's actually about emotional processing, and that's sort of one of these age-old questions that neurologists and psychologists have been dealing with, is the concept of emotional processing. And up until very recently, emotional processing has been looked at as something separate from intellectual processing, or thinking has been separate from feeling. And I'm going to talk today, hopefully, convince you that you cannot separate thinking from feeling. Thinking and feeling work together to process emotions. You all know I'm not a neurologist, I'm not a brain expert, but probably more classified as a brain hack. And I just like reading about brains, and especially the teenage brain. And this, like Philippe said, this is a little chunk of a presentation that I do called The Secret Life of the Teenage Brain. And this part has to do with emotional processing. The title of my presentation is The Emotional Brain, and it has a big long subtitle. You take the low road, I'll take the high road, and what's the deal with teenagers? This presentation for me is actually based on a whole bunch of reading and research that I've done on emotional processing and then how teenagers process emotions. This is going to be based on the work of a guy named Joseph Ledoux, who spent a great deal of his career studying fear, the emotion of fear, and how that's processed. Ledoux actually proposes these two types of emotional processing: the low road to emotional processing and the high road to emotional processing. And then I also studied somebody named Abigail Baird, who works with teenagers, and somebody named Deborah Yergelin-Todd, who also works with teenagers. And I think what I found is kind of a cool connection between these three researchers and how teenagers process emotions. And I'll throw in a little Daniel Goleman, the emotional IQ guy, to see and see how it all works together. First thing I want to do is explain this concept of high road emotional processing versus low road emotional processing. So, if you'll look at this slide, this is basically a graphic representation, and thanks to very current advances in brain imaging techniques, we're able to see how healthy brains function in real time. So if you can imagine, this is somebody's brain that's been sort of chopped in half right down the middle with an axe or some sort of saw. On the outside here is the cerebral cortex, which has a lot to do with thinking. And the inside of the brain, this is the limbic system, has a lot to do with emotional processing. So imagine, if you would, this little blue circle here is supposed to be an eyeball, not very cleverly drawn, but that's an eyeball. If you'll imagine some sensory information entering the eyeball, well, that sensory information moves to the thalamus. The thalamus is sort of the brain's center for transmitting sensory information to other parts of the brain. It's like the big train station. Well, sensory information enters the thalamus. It's processed then back to the cortex, the occipital lobe, which is responsible for processing visual information. At a certain point, that information moves to the prefrontal cortex, which Dr. Stanley told us earlier has a lot to do with thinking ahead and planning and decision making and impulse control. And finally, after this long circuitous route, this information finally gets processed in the amygdala, very deep in the limbic system and very much responsible for emotional processing. So you can see already that this particular model for processing emotions also involves some thinking and some higher order cognition. Does that make sense? This will make more sense when you see what the low road to emotional processing looks like. It's pretty quick. Imagine the same thing, some information coming in through the eyeball, directly to the thalamus, which then sort of decides quickly that some emotional decision has to be made, and it's processed immediately in the amygdala. Okay, what I want to show you is this is the high road to emotional processing, this is the low road to emotional processing. And high load and low road don't necessarily mean that one is better than the other one, but they do serve two very different functions. Imagine if you're, say, at the zoo, and you're standing behind the glass wall at the tiger cage, and the tiger lashes out at you. Your first emotion is probably a little bit of fear. So you get some visual information, the thalamus sends it back to the occipital lobe, and that fear is instantly sort of mitigated because you think about it. You stop yourself. You make a rational decision. This tiger can't hurt me. He's behind a glass wall. Does that make sense? The low road to processing, imagine you are out walking in the forest and you stumble upon a rattlesnake, and you see the snake and you hear that rattling noise. Instantly, your heart starts beating and perhaps you take a couple steps back. That's the low road to emotional processing. So, let's play a little game here. It's my argument that the low road to emotional processing has a lot to do with sort of act now and think later. And so I'd like you to play this little game with me called Good Idea, Bad Idea. All right, all I want you to do, I'm going to show you about 4 slides with a little sentence on it, and you can just yell out at me if you think this is a good idea or a bad idea. Doing the laundry. Good idea. It's a good idea. Number 2, riding your bike downstairs. Number 3, eating a cockroach. Number 4, swimming with sharks. Okay. Now, behind these kind of goofy questions is actually some fairly serious science. Now, this was Abigail Baird at Vassar University conducted an experiment using an fMRI machine, and this actually takes magnetic resonance images of the brain while it's working. So what Dr. Baird did was took a group of teenagers and asked them these questions, put them in this fMRI machine, and they had a little button in each hand. One button was good idea, one button was bad idea, and put them in this machine and tested them to see if they thought these things were good ideas or bad ideas. She did the same thing with a group of adults, put them through an fMRI machine and tested whether or not they thought these things were a good idea or a bad idea. So what do you think the results were? Well, the truth is that teenagers and adults both answered the questions properly. The teenagers knew that riding a bike downstairs was probably a bad idea. They knew that doing the laundry was probably a good idea. But there were a couple of significant differences. First of all, teenagers took about twice as long to answer the question. Okay, adults answered it really quickly. Teenagers took about twice as long to answer the question. So, kind of seems like adults may have been answering it without thinking. Teenagers had to think about those questions before they answered them. Something even more fascinating is with the MRI scans that Dr. Baird did, she found that teenagers actually process emotional decision making in a different part of the brain. Teenagers, this part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, lit up much more dramatically than any other part of the brain. So what does that mean? That teenagers actually, when asked to make emotional decisions, they stop and think about it. Pretty interesting. As compared to adults, the 2 areas that lit up the most were the occipital lobe, the visual processing center, and an instant emotional response. So for adults, making emotional decisions is something that comes much more instantly, and teenagers tend to think about emotional decisions. Pretty interesting. I would say teenagers tend to take the high road to emotional processing when making emotional decisions. Adults tend to take the low road, much quicker, much more automatic, act now, think later kind of decisions. So, another game to play. This one is called something. This is called Name That Emotion. Now I'm going to show you 4 pictures of people's faces displaying different emotions. And you can just yell out at me what you think these emotions are. Number 1. Shock. Number 2. Fear. Number 3. Anger. There's extra credit at the end if anybody knows who this is. Chad. All right. And number 4. Yeah, I don't know what that is either. So he's just grumpy, I think. So, all right. Again, behind these questions and these sort of silly pictures, there's actually some more serious brain science involved. And there was a research study by Deborah Yergel and Todd at McLean Hospital in Massachusetts, and she kind of did the same thing with a group of adults and a group of teenagers, put them through this functional magnetic resonance imaging machine, and showed, projected on the top, these pictures, these images, and asked the group of teenagers, identify the emotion that you see. Asked the adults, identify the emotion that you see. So, what do you think the results were? Actually, this time, teenagers got so many of the answers wrong. As a matter of fact, 50% of teenagers failed to identify this picture as fear. Half of teenagers did not identify this as fear. On the other hand, 100% of the adults in the study identified this as fear. So just think about that for a minute. What in the world does that mean? That teenagers have such a hard time identifying emotions on people's faces. So, not only did teenagers give a lot of wrong or incorrect responses compared to adults, wouldn't you know it, they also tend to process identifying emotions in a different part of the brain and differently than adults do. Again, the fMRI images, teenagers, when they're trying to identify emotions on people's faces, tend to process that information with the low road to emotional processing. It's an instant, act now, think later, gut reaction to what they think or what they feel that emotion is. Adults, on the other hand, tend to process in the prefrontal cortex when identifying emotions. So the difference is, when identifying emotions, teenagers take the low road and they just have a gut reaction. How many of you have seen a teenager before that just thinks every look on your face is anger? I mean, that's, if any of you have teenagers, you know that's what the deal is. There's no such thing as subtle variations of anger. There's no disappointment, there's only anger. There's no frustration, there's only anger. So, I don't know what's going on here, but I think this fits very well with the concept of a low road to emotional processing and a high road to emotional processing. Adults tend to think these things through. I'm not sure what's going on, but I imagine adults are tapping into their experience. So I've seen this look before. What does this mean? I've seen that. The person that I was with before was frustrated, whatever it might be. So, really interesting thing about processing emotions. I believe that when identifying emotions, teenagers take the low road to emotional processing. Adults tend to take the high road to emotional processing. And when teenagers are making emotional decisions, they tend to think through things a lot. Rather than, like adults, they know instantly whether something's a good idea or a bad idea. If you can imagine a teenager making an emotional decision about, is it a good idea or a bad idea to get in a car with a drunk driver? Imagine the thinking of a teenager. I mean, first of all, let's just ask the adults in the room. Is that a good idea or a bad idea? Bad idea. Okay, you all know that. You didn't have to think about it too much. Teenagers do something like this. Well, let's see. Getting in a car with a drunk driver. Well, I just had a health class where Miss Krabappel said that you could actually, if you weighed 175 pounds, you could actually have 2 drinks an hour as long as you had a good meal before. And my buddy Carl is pretty heavy, so he's probably okay. And it's probably safer for me to ride with a drunk driver than it is to walk home for a mile. Or it's not really that far. I'm sure I'll probably be okay. So teenagers tend to overthink things. So here's my ultimate theory. It really seems that teenagers tend to be reacting when they should probably be thinking a little bit more, and they may be thinking a little too much when they should be reacting a little bit more. Or in other words, they often take the wrong road when processing their emotions. In terms of Daniel Goleman, who wrote Emotional EQ, Emotional Intelligence, I think this may be what emotional intelligence is the actual fluid coordination of low road emotional processing and high road emotional processing that I think doesn't come without a rich variety of emotional experience. That's my theory. Thanks for coming. Drive safely.